So we'll move now to hear from Ross Elliot, an old friend of NGAA, who is a director of Suburban Futures. He's based in Brisbane. He has a long history in development, and he has a lot of really good, sound and strong opinions on suburbia and renewal. And today he's going to talk to us about the economic challenge in suburbia. So Ross, welcome, and over to you.
Bronwyn, thanks very much indeed. Pleasure to be here. Let me just see if I can get this right. You should see my opening screen now with luck.
Yes, just need to...
presentation mode, there we are.
Presentation mode. There, perfect. Well done.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks very much. And welcome everyone to this afternoon. I found those previous chats really eye-opening, actually. Thank you. And I'm afraid, Rob Hall, my graphics is nowhere near as competent as yours, but hopefully the data will speak for itself, so bear with me. One of the things I like to remind people of is that we don't need to be apologists for suburbia. It's not a condition that needs to be cured, and it's not an ailment that needs to be treated. I think some of us who work in this space would sometimes be forgiven for thinking that we're supporting some sort of inferior urban form, whereas I'm hoping to show you that, in fact, quite the opposite could well be true. But that is a legacy, I think, of many, many decades of fairly derisive narrative about what it is to be a suburban place, outer suburban, high growth, new growth areas. Many of you would be familiar with this work by Lewis Mumford, first published in 1961, where he described, well, I'll tell you what he described. He pretty much described this, which was Levittown in the US. And this image is used a lot at design and planning conferences to describe the worst form of suburban growth, the things that we should do our very best to avoid. But I think it's very important as well to realise that this was a time in history, and that the people who were coming to Levittown in that day were escaping inner cities, which at the time were full of disease. There was a lot of overcrowding. There was significant crime. So these were places that people wanted to escape from if they had the opportunity. And that opportunity came in the form of suburban development. And most of that suburban development and growth was enabled by the private motor car. And that's, to an extent, still the legacy we're living with today. The other thing I like to remind people about with respect to some of this outer suburban growth is that we look at it on its opening day, if you like. If you can imagine master plan communities in Australia, those who prefer to deride them as sprawl and little else, will show them without the trees having grown, without the infrastructure in place. If you look at Levittown today, that aerial image of before is now this image on the ground. The trees have grown in, the schools have been established, the local shops and communities have taken root. So it's very different. We have to allow some of these places time to evolve, and it's not a theme park. We can't have everything done the way we'd like to have it done on day one. One of the questions I guess we are now starting to ask is, particularly post-COVID, are we seeing a suburban and regional renaissance, or is it simply that we are simply just waking up to the reality of the suburban and regional economy and experience? You'd all be familiar with the phrase that this year or recently, half of the world's population are now living in cities. But what we're less familiar with is the reality that much of that growth, in fact, nearly all of that growth, is taking place in the suburbs and the exurbs, or the outer urban areas attached to those large cities. And interestingly, the same is true of jobs. I pulled this data together from a wide variety of sources. Some of the Australian cities are down the bottom, and what this shows is the proportion of metropolitan-wide jobs that are in CBDs or inner cities. And while I was always familiar with the Australian experience, which is that, look, depending on how you want to draw the boundaries, between 10 and 15% typically of a metro region's job market is in the CBD or inner city. What really surprised me was that it was very similar for that whole range of international cities, and even places like New York, which we imagine, I guess, as largely just Manhattan. Of course, New York metropolitan area is a great deal larger than just Manhattan. Even there, the core only accounts for 20% of the metro region's job market. And of course, that means the inverse is true, that 80% of our jobs typically are not located in CBDs or inner cities. It's a point that Solly Angel, who is one of my go-to guys, who's written some wonderful books on cities and their economies. Solly observed this back in 2016, so well before COVID. He observed that across America, the majority of jobs, three or four of them, are dispersed outside of CBDs in places where walking or cycling isn't feasible, and that if you were to increase the productivity of American cities, it would be sensible to focus on meeting the travel demands of the majority of the commuters who are working in those non-core areas, rather than what we've seen here, and I think probably also true elsewhere in the world, a preoccupation with the transport needs of those who are working in CBDs. I think this is a point that Rob made earlier too, that the economy is changing. In Australia's case, this illustrates the growth in jobs from the early 90s to around 2017 and 18. And the jobs that were driving our economy back then: information, media, telecommunications, the professions and scientific and technical services, and finance and insurance services, banking, in other words. So these were jobs that were typically CBD orientated at the time, and that drove a lot of growth of their city centre cores, but that has changed enormously. And here you see the 5 years to May this year. The fastest growing industry is now healthcare and social assistance. Education and training is number 3, and the professions are still up there. The highest growth industries from that previous graph are now down at the bottom of the league ladder and contributing very little growth to the economy. So what you're seeing is that the highest growth industries are now typically non-city centre by their very nature, which should be good news. So here's the split. Even amongst white-collar professionals, 76%, or 3/4 of them, are typically found in the suburban business districts or salt and peppered across the suburban metro regions of our cities, which is much higher than I thought would be the case. But in the case of educators, 93% of them are located in suburban and outer suburban areas, and in the case of health, 90% of those jobs in outer suburban areas. And keep in mind that these are now the fastest growing industries, and they are typically non-city centre. So this should be driving a lot of opportunity for us across our suburban and regional centres. And to an extent it is, if we are ready for them, if we're ready for them. And I think the reason we're not perhaps as ready for them as we should be is that we are still faced with an ongoing policy challenge, which reflects a lot of legacy thinking. And just to illustrate that, this is from the latest South East Queensland Regional Plan. Here are the population projections out to 2046. And on its own, you might look at these projections and say, oh, yes, well, it's fine. High growth regions, Moreton Bay, Logan, Ipswich, Gold Coast, and so on. But it's when you put those same projections against the job projections in the same plan, you realise that we're actually planning to fail. And sadly, I think for places like Moreton Bay, which is an outer northern area of Brisbane, Australia's newest city, in fact, I think they've been declared, while they're predicted to have 300,000 more people living there by 2046, the very same strategic plan predicts only slightly more than 50,000 jobs in that market, which simply means, and you all know this, that a large proportion of those populations, those increased populations, are going to be living in a Moreton Bay or a Logan or an Ipswich and forced to commute somewhere else, potentially a large distance, to access work. I think the tragedy here is that what we're doing with so much of our regional planning is that it is essentially a plan around population and housing. And that what we ought to be doing, perhaps, is to start thinking about plans for jobs, for the economy, for social infrastructure, working out where we're going to try locate those hubs in the most convenient locations, and then building the housing supply challenge around that. So starting from a completely different perspective. And I think this is probably a very similar story across Australia. We make it worse, I think, by where we spend our money. And this is an analysis of 12 years worth of state budgets, and we wanted to take a longer term view to iron out the lumpiness that state budgets invariably have. But what it shows is that the inner city of Brisbane has received the lion's share of capital spending by region in that time, and that the high growth areas that you saw in the previous graph, Moreton Bay North in green on the bottom right of the screen, Moreton Bay South received the lowest. Really, if you were to be doing this correctly, you would be doing the opposite. You would be putting the money where the highest growth is, and keeping in mind too that these outer urban areas where entirely new suburbs are being planned are starting with almost no pre-existing infrastructure. They've started as rural paddocks. Everything has to be put in, from the underground services to the on-surface roads and other infrastructure, and schools and hospitals and cop shops and ambulance stations, and you name it. Everything that goes with that growth has to be installed, whereas it's already there in the inner city. So not only do we need to provide the infrastructure to support the growth, we've got to provide infrastructure from the get-go, right? As if there was nothing there beforehand. I find that it's very useful to envisage what success looks like. Suburban Futures started with this hypothetical example of a main street in Australia, and we to the graphic designer, we said, well, just imagine something that's typically bad. So this has all the ingredients of, you know, long-term for lease signs and for sale signs, and we've got vaping stores and pawn shops and pubs with pokie rooms and nothing much else, and so on. And what's really surprised me is the number of people who've come forward and said, I recognise that's in my neighbourhood. Which says a lot about the standard of many of our suburban and regional high streets, I guess. So what do we do to envisage what success might look like? Well, obviously there's the public realm, so we make the place more accessible, whether that means walkability at the local level or access via public transport. We look to inject particularly the industries around health, allied medical, education, professionals, and so on. And of course, we add a great deal in terms of environmental quality. Another example is this. This is a real-world example. This is Maruka in Brisbane, a suburban auto mall area of 2 or 3 kilometres in length. This is it pretty much today. The car yards have been struggling for many years, but the legacy zonings have meant that change has been very difficult. The work I'm doing with Brisbane City Council is trying to change all that through a combination of land use changes, but also through adding a lot of placemaking amenity in order to attract the sort of industries we'd like to see there, and to get a greater density of employment into the area. And to show that this is in fact possible, this is a real-world example of Nunda Village, a middle suburban neighbourhood north of Brisbane. The images down the right and across the bottom show that I've really struggled for a technical term of what you would describe this as in a planning sense. Obviously, but ugly would come close. It was a rundown centre. It was a traffic sewer, but the state government invested about 60 million back in the day in a traffic bypass. The council invested maybe 5 million in some streetscaping and, importantly, land use zoning changes. And that has attracted, since then, $840 million and counting in new capital investment. So it's for private money that's done the heavy lifting. And very happily, what's happened as well is there's been a 72% increase in jobs in that district. So people can now work closer to where they live or live closer to where they work, which is a great outcome. It's one of few success stories of suburban renewal. But it proves it works. Now, to get us there, there's a few things I think we need to do. The first, I think, which is a challenge for this country, is to try to detach ourselves from this addiction to very high or very rapid growth. The graph on the left shows Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne projected population increases to 2050, and keeping in mind that most of that increase in those three cities will be in suburban and outer suburban areas, despite the 70-30 infill rules that are in place. And you can see our growth rates compared with a number of global cities across the middle. So we are expected to grow more than some of these very large global cities. And for comparison's sake, I've put in the projected growth of some cities like Delhi, Mumbai, or Lagos in Africa to show that in terms of raw numbers, perhaps our growth isn't that scary. But on the graph on the right, if you look at it in percentage terms, that illustrates in effect the speed at which we're planning to grow our larger urban centres. And it's that speed that worries me terribly, because we should know by experience that we're not very good at doing things even at a modest rate. This is the rate of growth that third world cities like Delhi and Mumbai and Lagos, I'm afraid, who do not have the sort of regulatory networks that we do, or nor do they have the expectations in terms of quality and engineering that we do. They might be able to achieve it, but you can imagine the mess they will leave behind. To think that we will be proceeding at the same pace of growth, I think is very scary. Now, just some final thoughts, if I can, a shopping list of policy and practice in order to enable better suburban and regional economic growth. The first thing I would say is to think much more carefully about who are the new anchors of the economy. And in particular, education and health, as previous speakers have already identified, these will drive a lot of growth. I think it's important too that we understand there's a lot of money out there. There's actually no shortage of capital, but we need to learn to work with developers much more closely to leverage their access to capital and to convert that into the sort of places and into the sort of economic results that we expect. There's no point keeping them out of the room, which is a trap I think sadly we've fallen into. Related to that is that planners need partners. So a room full of planners or a room full of architects talking to other architects or talking to other planners isn't going to achieve much other than an echo chamber. We really need to bring all of the brains trust to the same table: developers, economists, landscape architects, engineers, researchers, designers, financiers, and so on. They all have something to contribute, and it's important that all perspectives are taken into account if planning for growth. We don't leverage our assets sufficiently. I think we tended to develop suburban and regional centres around standalone opportunities. A library, for example, I came across this in Brisbane recently. A new library was proposed near Everton Park, and I was desperately trying to get it incorporated into a redeveloped shopping centre precinct, which was much loved by the locals. But sadly, the announcement had been made before I could get in and influence the policy, and the library is now a standalone building, only maybe 500 or 600 metres away, but it requires a separate trip and a separate car park. And sadly, I think we would have had more people visiting the library had it been incorporated into an existing centre, if that asset had been leveraged. But as it is, it's a lesson for us to learn in the future, hopefully. And finally, just simply that we should use all the levers we have. Local governments have very limited access to policy levers. State and federal governments have a great deal more, in that if we wanted to incentivise a particular precinct or business district for economic growth for whatever reason, and there was broad agreement that this was a place to do it, there is no reason that state governments couldn't offer payroll tax relief for companies establishing in that area, why federal governments couldn't offer income tax relief for employees working in particular areas. This is the sort of cross-governmental cooperation that you do see, particularly in places like the US, in some places in the US, and it has proven to be enormously successful. I think the sad thing is if we leave local governments to try to do it all on their own in this country, we're just not going to get there. So look, that is it. Thank you all very much for your time. Bronwyn, and back over to you.
Thanks, Ross. That's fascinating. I really love that different perspective that you take, and I think we all have a lot to learn from that. So thank you. We will come back during question time.